At my son-in-law's promotion party, he picked up the microphone, looked straight at me, and said, "My mother-in-law only came tonight because she heard the champagne was free." The room erupted in laughter. Not loud, uncontrollable laughter, but the kind that spreads slowly across a crowd when people aren't sure whether they should laugh, but decide to do it anyway. I remember standing there in the middle of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water, wondering if I had heard him correctly. My son-in-law, Daniel Carter. The man my daughter had married 8 years earlier. The man I had welcomed into our family with open arms. And now, apparently, the man who thought humiliating his wife's mother in front of 200 colleagues was the perfect punchline for his promotion speech. But before I tell you what happened next, let me say something first. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always like knowing how far these stories travel. Because what happened that night was the moment I realized something about my family that I had refused to see for years. And it all began in a place that was supposed to be a celebration. The Grand Regency Hotel in downtown Chicago. The ballroom looked exactly like the kind of place people imagine when they hear the words executive promotion party. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling so high it made everyone look smaller beneath it. Round tables covered with ivory linen filled the room, each one decorated with tall arrangements of white roses and gold ribbon. A small jazz band played quietly near the bar. Waiters in black suits moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. Everything about the evening was elegant, carefully arranged, carefully planned. I had spent extra time getting ready that afternoon. At 67, I don't attend many formal events anymore, but this one felt important. My daughter, Emily, had called me 2 weeks earlier. "Mom, Daniel's finally getting promoted to senior partner," she said excitedly. "They're throwing him a big party at the firm. You have to come. You have to come." Those words meant something to me. After my husband Robert passed away 5 years ago, family gatherings had become fewer and farther between. People get busy. Lives move on. So when Emily insisted I be there, I took it seriously. I chose a pale blue dress that Robert had always liked. Nothing flashy, just something elegant and simple. I even wore the small pearl necklace he gave me on our 30th anniversary. As I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving the house, I could almost hear his voice. "You look beautiful, Margaret." Robert always said that even when it wasn't true. The drive into the city took about 40 minutes. Chicago traffic was unusually calm that evening, the sky fading from orange to deep blue as the sun disappeared behind the skyline. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was already buzzing with guests. Most of them were younger than me. Sharp suits, designer dresses, the confident laughter of people who worked in corporate offices and talked about mergers over lunch. I suddenly felt very aware of my age. But Emily spotted me almost immediately. "Mom," she called, weaving through the crowd. She hugged me quickly, though her attention seemed divided between greeting guests and checking her phone. "You made it. Daniel will be so happy you're here." I remember smiling at her. "Of course I came," I said. "I wouldn't miss this." And I meant it, because Daniel's success hadn't come easily. When he first met Emily, he was a junior associate at a struggling law firm, working long hours for very little recognition. There were nights when he and Emily would sit at my kitchen table, worrying about student loans and rent payments. Robert and I had helped them more than once during those early years. But that's a story for later. That evening, I simply wanted to celebrate. The ballroom filled steadily as more guests arrived. Daniel moved through the room like a man who belonged there, shaking hands, laughing loudly, accepting congratulations from colleagues and clients. He looked confident, successful, powerful. Every once in a while he would glance in my direction and give a brief nod. Not warm, not unfriendly, just polite. Emily stayed close to him most of the evening, introducing him to new partners and investors. I spent most of the time seated at one of the side tables, chatting with a few of Daniel's co-workers who seemed genuinely kind. Around 8 o'clock, the music softened. Someone tapped a spoon against a champagne glass. The signal everyone recognizes at events like this. Daniel stepped onto the small stage near the center of the ballroom. He adjusted his tie, accepted the microphone from the event coordinator, and waited for the room to quiet down. 200 conversations slowly faded into silence. "Good evening, everyone," he began. His voice carried easily across the room. "I want to thank the firm for believing in me and giving me the opportunity to grow here." Polite applause followed. He continued speaking about his career, about the long hours, the sacrifices, the mentors who had helped him succeed. Standard promotion speech. Nothing unusual. Then he paused, and his eyes drifted across the room. For a moment, I thought he was looking for Emily. Instead, his gaze settled directly on me. A slow smile spread across his face. You know, he said, events like this bring out all kinds of people. The room chuckled lightly. Friends, colleagues, family. He lifted his champagne glass. And sometimes, he continued, people who just heard there might be free food and drinks. The crowd laughed louder this time. Daniel tilted his head slightly toward my table. My mother-in-law, for example, he said into the microphone. She never misses a chance when the champagne is free. The laughter exploded. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. For a second, no one seemed sure how I would react. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I simply stood there holding my glass, listening to the sound of strangers laughing at a joke made at my expense. And in that moment, under the bright lights of the Grand Regency ballroom, I realized something. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a harmless joke. And the most painful part of all was when I looked across the room and saw my daughter Emily standing beside her husband. Not shocked, not angry, just smiling politely, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. For a few seconds, the laughter continued. Not cruel laughter exactly. More like the kind people produce at corporate events when the person holding the microphone is the one who signs their paychecks. Some guests quickly looked away, pretending to sip their champagne. Others kept smiling, unsure whether the joke had gone too far. I simply stood there. The glass in my hand suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Sparkling water. No champagne. Ironically, I had never liked champagne very much. I lowered the glass slowly and set it down on the nearest table. Daniel continued his speech as if nothing unusual had happened. And of course, he said with a grin, family keeps you humble. Another ripple of laughter passed through the room. Then he went right back to thanking his partners, his clients, and the firm that had just promoted him. The moment was over, at least for everyone else. But for me, something had shifted quietly inside my chest. I glanced across the ballroom again. Emily was standing near the stage, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She looked perfectly comfortable, smiling as colleagues congratulated her husband. For a moment, I waited. I expected her to look over at me, maybe to roll her eyes at his joke, maybe to mouth the words I'm sorry, but she didn't. Her attention stayed on Daniel, on his success, on the people surrounding him. I felt a strange warmth rise to my face, not anger exactly, but something close to embarrassment. Not for him, for myself. Because the truth was, this wasn't the first time I had heard that tone in Daniel's voice. That subtle hint that I was unnecessary, unimportant, just someone who happened to be there. I moved quietly toward the edge of the ballroom and took a seat at one of the tables near the back wall. From there I could see almost the entire room. The chandeliers above us shimmered like frozen stars. Waiters continued circulating with trays of drinks and small plates of appetizers. The jazz band started playing again, soft piano drifting through the air as guests returned to their conversations. Within minutes, the joke had already been forgotten. People were laughing again, talking about business deals, vacation homes, investment opportunities. And Daniel stood at the center of it all like a man who had finally arrived exactly where he believed he belonged. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, watching, listening, and slowly, memory began to do something curious. Moments from the past, little things I had ignored for years, started lining up in my mind. Small comments, subtle looks, times when Daniel had spoken about family, as if I wasn't really part of it. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. After all, when your daughter marries someone, you want the marriage to succeed. You want to believe that man respects the family he married into. But sitting there in the quiet corner of that elegant ballroom, with the music playing and strangers laughing around me, I finally allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for 8 years. What if Daniel Carter had never respected me at all? And more importantly, what if everyone else in that room already knew it? I sat there for a long time without moving. When you reach a certain age, you learn something important about public humiliation. You don't fight it. Not in a room full of strangers. You don't raise your voice. You don't argue. And you certainly don't cry. You keep your posture straight. You breathe slowly. And you let the moment pass. That's what dignity looks like when you're 67 years old. The party around me continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Music drifted through the ballroom again. Glasses clinked together. Laughter rose and fell like soft waves across the room. Daniel had stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by colleagues. Several men in expensive suits were shaking his hand. Senior partner at 40, one of them said loudly. "That's impressive." Daniel laughed modestly, though the pride in his voice was impossible to miss. "It's been a long road," he replied. Emily stood beside him, glowing with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life had turned out exactly the way she hoped. Every now and then she adjusted Daniel's tie or touched his arm when someone congratulated him. Watching them from across the room, you would think they were the perfect couple. Successful, confident, untouchable. A waiter stopped near my table and offered a tray of champagne. "Would you like a glass, ma'am?" I smiled politely and shook my head. "No, thank you." He nodded and moved on. I glanced again toward the center of the room. Daniel was telling another story now, his voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Those early years were tough," he was saying. "Student loans, cheap apartments, ramen noodles for dinner." Several people laughed. "But you pushed through," one woman said admiringly. Daniel nodded. "That's right. You have to build your own life. No one hands it to you." I noticed a few heads turning toward me again. Not openly, just quick glances. Curious, measuring. And suddenly I understood something that made my stomach tighten slightly. That joke earlier. It hadn't been random. Daniel hadn't looked at me by accident. He had chosen that moment very carefully. Because in rooms like this, rooms filled with lawyers, executives, and investors, reputation matters. Image matters. People want to believe that success is earned entirely through personal strength. Not family help. Not quiet support from someone behind the scenes. And certainly not from a mother-in-law. I rested my hands on the table and studied the pattern in the ivory tablecloth. Slowly, another memory surfaced. 8 years earlier. The first time Daniel had ever sat at my kitchen table. Back then, he was nervous, respectful, grateful even. He had looked me straight in the eye and said something I remembered very clearly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I promise I'll take good care of Emily." I believed him, just like I believed something else he said that same night. That family was the most important thing in the world to him. Sitting there in that glittering ballroom, watching him laugh with his new partners, I finally realized something. Daniel Carter had kept one of those promises. He had taken very good care of Emily. But the other promise? The one about family. That one had quietly disappeared somewhere along the road to his promotion. And I was beginning to suspect that tonight's little joke was only the beginning. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it builds slowly. One small moment at a time. Sitting there at that quiet table near the back of the ballroom, I began remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. Little details. Things that once seemed too small to matter. But now, in the bright light of Daniel's promotion party, they suddenly looked very different. I remembered the first apartment Daniel and Emily rented after they got married. A small place on the north side of Chicago. 1 bedroom. Thin walls. A kitchen barely big enough for 2 people. They were both working long hours then. Emily had just started her job at a marketing firm, and Daniel was still a junior associate at a law office that barely paid him enough to cover rent. One evening they came to my house for dinner. Emily looked tired. Daniel looked worried. After we finished eating, they stayed at the table longer than usual. Finally, Emily cleared her throat. "Mom, we're a little behind this month." Daniel looked embarrassed. "It's just temporary," he added quickly. "Things will get better once I move up at the firm." I remember smiling at them. "Of course they will," I said. That night, I wrote them a check for $3,000. I told them it was just a loan. But the truth was, I never expected it back. And that wasn't the only time. There were other moments. The car repair Daniel couldn't afford during his second year at the firm. The hospital bill when Emily had that sudden infection. The down payment for their first house in Evanston. That one had been the biggest. $25,000. Robert had passed away only 6 months earlier, and the insurance money had just arrived. Part of me hesitated. But Emily sounded so hopeful when she talked about that little house with the maple tree in the front yard. So I helped them. Because that's what parents do. You don't keep score. You don't ask for recognition. You simply show up when your children need you. Across the ballroom, Daniel's voice rose above the music again. "People respect you more when you build everything yourself," he was saying to a group of partners. Several of them nodded approvingly. One man clapped him on the shoulder. That's the American way. Daniel laughed. Exactly. I watched him for a moment. His confidence. The easy way he moved through the room. The way people leaned in when he spoke. And suddenly another memory surfaced. 3 years ago. A Sunday afternoon dinner at Emily and Daniel's house. We were sitting around the table after dessert when one of Daniel's colleagues asked him how he and Emily managed to buy their home so quickly. Daniel shrugged casually. Good planning, he said. Emily said nothing. And I said nothing. Because at the time, I told myself something very simple. Family doesn't need credit. Family just helps. But sitting there in that ballroom tonight, watching Daniel Carter celebrate the success he claimed to have built entirely on his own, I began to wonder something I had never allowed myself to ask before. Had my help ever meant anything to him at all? Or had I simply been convenient? I continued sitting at that table while the party moved on around me. Conversations blended together into a soft hum. The jazz band shifted into a slower tune. Some guests began drifting toward the bar while others gathered around Daniel, eager to congratulate the firm's newest senior partner. From a distance, the evening probably looked perfect. The kind of professional celebration people post on LinkedIn the next morning. Honored to celebrate this milestone with incredible colleagues. Grateful for the support of family. Those kinds of words. But the longer I sat there, the more I started noticing something else. The way people looked at me. Not openly. No one pointed or whispered loudly. But every so often someone's eyes would drift toward my table. Just for a second. Then they would look away quickly, as if they weren't sure whether acknowledging me would be awkward. I recognized that look. It's the same expression people use when they witness something uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. A few minutes later, someone approached my table. He was a tall man in his early 50s, wearing a navy suit and silver-rimmed glasses. I had seen him earlier standing near the stage while Daniel was giving his speech. He offered a polite smile. Mrs. Whitmore, right? I nodded. Yes. I'm Richard Langford, he said. One of the senior partners. His handshake was firm but gentle. I just wanted to say congratulations. Daniel has done excellent work here. Thank you, I replied. He hesitated slightly before pulling out the chair across from me. Do you mind if I sit for a moment? Of course not. For a few seconds we both watched the party continue across the ballroom. Then he spoke again. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been in this business a long time. I nodded politely. And I've noticed something about successful people. He folded his hands on the table. The ones who last the longest usually remember who helped them along the way. The sentence hung in the air between us. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't said Daniel's name. But the meaning was clear. I studied his face carefully. There was no mockery in his expression, only something that looked surprisingly close to concern. Daniel is very ambitious, I said carefully. Richard gave a small smile. Yes, he said. That he is. Across the room, Daniel had just raised another glass of champagne. Someone shouted a toast. More laughter followed. Richard glanced in that direction for a moment. Then he leaned slightly closer to me. You must be very proud of your daughter, he said. I am. And Daniel? The question was quiet, almost casual, but I understood what he was really asking. I paused before answering. For years, my response would have been automatic. Of course I'm proud. That's what mothers say. But tonight, something inside me felt different. I looked across the ballroom again. At Daniel standing beneath the bright chandeliers. At Emily smiling beside him. At the crowd celebrating the man he had become. And for the first time since I arrived at that party, I didn't feel pride. I felt something else. Something colder. I used to be, I said quietly. Richard Langford studied my face for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if he understood far more about this family than I had ever realized. Richard Langford didn't stay long. After a minute or two, he stood up and straightened his jacket. Well, he said politely, I should get back before Daniel starts wondering where one of his partners disappeared to. I nodded. Of course. He hesitated for a brief moment before leaving. Then he added something quietly. Enjoy the evening, Mrs. Whitmore. It sounded less like a suggestion and more like a wish. He walked back toward the crowd gathering around Daniel, disappearing almost immediately into the circle of congratulating colleagues. I remained where I was. The chair felt unusually still beneath me. Across the ballroom, someone had started another toast. Glasses rose into the air. To Daniel. The room echoed the words. To Daniel. Champagne sparkled beneath the chandeliers like tiny fireworks. Daniel lifted his glass with a confident smile. Thank you, everyone, he said. This means a lot. Applause followed. Emily leaned closer to him, whispering something that made him laugh. From a distance, they looked exactly like the kind of couple people admire. Young enough to enjoy success. Smart enough to achieve it. Lucky enough to share it together. For a moment, I allowed myself to study my daughter's face. Emily had always been a gentle child. When she was little, she used to leave handwritten notes around the house. Love you, Mom. Have a good day at work. Small things like that. I used to keep those notes in a box in my bedroom drawer. Somewhere along the way, the girl who wrote those little messages had grown into someone I barely recognized. A woman who stood quietly beside her husband while he made jokes about her mother. A woman who smiled and said nothing. I wasn't angry with her. Not exactly. Mostly, I felt something heavier. Disappointment. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet realization settling slowly into place. After a few more minutes, I stood up from the table. No one stopped me. No one really noticed. People were too busy celebrating. I walked slowly across the ballroom floor. The music from the jazz band had grown louder now. A saxophone drifted through the air, smooth and elegant. Guests moved aside politely as I passed. Most of them assumed I was heading toward the bar. Instead, I stopped near the edge of the crowd surrounding Daniel. He was in the middle of another conversation, explaining something about a major case the firm had recently won. Emily noticed me first. Her smile flickered slightly. Mom, she said, are you enjoying the party? The question sounded automatic. The kind people ask without really expecting an answer. Daniel turned when he heard my name. For a brief second, surprise crossed his face. Perhaps he hadn't expected me to approach him again after his speech. Then his usual confident smile returned. Margaret, he said, lifting his glass slightly. Good to see you still here. Still here. The phrase lingered in the air longer than he probably intended. I met his eyes calmly. Yes, I said. I thought I'd stay a little longer. Neither of them spoke. For a moment, the noise of the party seemed to fade slightly around us. And that was when I realized something important. For the first time that evening, Daniel Carter looked just a little bit uncomfortable. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Daniel still held his champagne glass halfway in the air, as if he had forgotten what he planned to say next. Emily glanced between us, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her own glass. Around us, the party continued. Someone laughed loudly behind Daniel. A waiter passed carrying a tray of tiny desserts. The band shifted into another slow jazz melody. But inside that small circle where the three of us stood, the atmosphere had changed. Daniel cleared his throat. Well, he said lightly, I hope you didn't take that little joke earlier too seriously. His smile returned again, the same confident smile he had worn all evening. You know how these things are. People expect a little humor during speeches. Emily nodded quickly beside him. It was just a joke, Mom, she added. Her voice sounded careful, gentle, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. I looked at both of them quietly. At 67, you develop a certain patience with conversations like this. You don't rush your words. You let silence do some of the work. Finally, I spoke. I understand what a joke is, I said calmly. Daniel chuckled. Good, he replied. Because some people can be a little sensitive at these events. He took a sip of champagne, clearly satisfied that the situation had been smoothed over. But something in his tone made a few nearby guests glance in our direction again. People are very good at sensing tension, even when no one raises their voice. Emily shifted her weight slightly. Mom came all the way from the suburbs tonight, she said to Daniel, as if trying to soften the moment. Daniel nodded casually. Well, I'm glad she could make it. The words sounded polite, but they carried no warmth. For a moment I studied his face. The expensive suit, the confident posture, the comfortable certainty of someone who believed the room belonged to him. Then I said something very simple. You're right, Daniel. He looked pleased. About the joke? He asked. Yes. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. I understand exactly why you told it. Daniel blinked once. Only once. It was a small reaction, but I noticed it immediately. Because suddenly, he wasn't quite as relaxed as he had been a moment earlier. What do you mean? He asked. Before I could answer, someone behind him interrupted. Daniel, we need you for another photo. A group of colleagues were gathering near the stage where a photographer had just set up lights. Daniel turned slightly, clearly relieved by the distraction. Be right there, he called. Then he looked back at me. Excuse me for a moment, he said politely. Emily followed him as he moved toward the photographer. Within seconds they were surrounded by co-workers again, smiling for pictures under the bright lights of the ballroom. I remained standing where I was, watching, listening, and slowly, another thought settled into place. Daniel believed the evening had already ended in his favor. The successful promotion, the laughter from the crowd, the little joke about his mother-in-law. To him, the story of tonight was already finished. But as I stood there beneath the chandeliers of the Grand Regency ballroom, I realized something very important. For me, the evening had only just begun. I didn't return to my table. Instead, I walked slowly toward the large windows along the side of the ballroom. From there, the city of Chicago stretched out in a grid of lights, traffic moving steadily along the streets far below. The glass reflected the room behind me, chandeliers glowing, waiters weaving through guests, Daniel standing beneath bright camera flashes while colleagues clapped him on the back. The photographer raised his camera. "All right, everyone, closer together." Daniel stood in the center, naturally, Emily beside him. Someone handed Daniel another glass of champagne. "Senior partner deserves a real toast," one of the lawyers joked. More laughter. Flash. Another photo. From where I stood, I could hear fragments of their conversation drifting across the room. "Hard work pays off. You earned it. Not many people make it this far this young." Daniel smiled modestly, but he didn't correct any of them. He didn't mention long nights studying while Emily worked extra hours. He didn't mention the early bills that had almost forced them to leave Chicago. And he certainly didn't mention the quiet help that had kept them afloat more than once. But that wasn't really what stayed with me. What stayed with me was something much smaller. A memory that suddenly resurfaced while I watched those photographs being taken. 6 years ago, Emily and Daniel had invited me to dinner at their new house in Evanston, the one with the maple tree in the front yard. It was the first time they hosted a full dinner after moving in. Emily had cooked pasta. Daniel opened a bottle of wine that was probably more expensive than anything I had ever bought for myself. During dinner, one of their neighbors asked how long they had been planning to buy a house. Daniel answered easily. "About 3 years," he said. "Smart saving and good timing." The neighbor nodded approvingly. "That's impressive for a young couple." Emily looked down at her plate, and I said nothing. I told myself it didn't matter. Families help each other. No one needs to list every detail. But now, standing beside that tall window with the city lights behind me and the sound of Daniel's celebration filling the room, I realized something I had never admitted before. Silence has a strange effect over time. The longer you stay quiet about something, the easier it becomes for other people to rewrite the story. Across the ballroom, the photographer lowered his camera. "That's perfect," he said. Daniel laughed and raised his glass again. "To the future." Everyone cheered. I watched the scene for another moment. Then I turned away from the window, because suddenly I understood something very clearly. For 8 years, I had allowed Daniel Carter to tell the story of his success however he wanted. But tonight, for the first time, I was starting to wonder what might happen if someone finally told the rest of it. For a few minutes, I simply walked through the ballroom. Not toward the stage. Not toward Daniel. Just through the room. Sometimes when people feel embarrassed at an event, they rush to leave. They grab their coat, make a quick excuse, and disappear before anyone notices. I didn't do that. Instead, I moved slowly between the tables, past groups of lawyers and clients who were still discussing cases and promotions. Most of them didn't know who I was. To them, I was just an older woman at a corporate celebration. But a few people recognized me from Daniel's speech. I could see it in the way their conversations paused for a second as I passed. Not cruel, just curious. At one table, 2 younger associates were talking quietly. "That joke was a little rough," one of them said under his breath. The other shrugged. "Maybe, but Daniel's always been confident." They noticed me walking by and immediately changed the subject. Corporate politeness has its own rules. You don't criticize someone who just became senior partner. Across the room, the music shifted again. The band had begun playing something slightly more upbeat now, and a few guests were even starting to dance near the bar. Daniel remained at the center of attention. Someone had pulled him into another conversation near the stage. I watched as he leaned forward slightly, explaining something to a group of partners. Every movement of his looked practiced, comfortable, like someone who had spent years learning exactly how to command a room. Emily stood beside him again, smiling politely at everyone who spoke to them. For a moment, I considered leaving. I could already imagine the drive home. The quiet highway. The radio playing softly. My small house waiting in the suburbs. No music. No laughter. Just silence. And for a few seconds, that silence sounded appealing. But then something else caught my attention. Near the bar, I noticed Richard Langford again. He was speaking with two other partners, but when he saw me across the room, he gave a small nod. Not dramatic. Just acknowledgement. It reminded me of something he had said earlier. The ones who last the longest usually remember who helped them along the way. I looked back toward Daniel. Another round of laughter had broken out near his group. Someone clapped him on the shoulder again. Your speech earlier was hilarious, a man said loudly. Daniel grinned. Well, he replied, every family needs a little comic relief. More laughter. A few people glanced toward me again. And suddenly I understood something important. Daniel believed that moment on the stage had defined the entire night. The promotion, the applause, the joke about his mother-in-law. To him, that was the story everyone would remember. But standing there in that ballroom, I realized something he hadn't considered. Stories have a strange way of changing depending on who gets the last word. And for the first time since his speech began earlier that evening, I started to wonder what might happen if Daniel Carter didn't get that final word after all. I walked toward the bar, not because I wanted a drink, but because that was where people gathered when the formal part of a corporate party began to fade into casual conversation. The bartender smiled politely as I approached. Champagne, ma'am. I shook my head. Just sparkling water, please. He handed me a tall glass with a slice of lemon resting on the rim. I thanked him and turned slightly so I could see the ballroom again. Daniel was still surrounded by colleagues near the stage. The crowd around him had grown smaller now as some guests moved toward the dance floor or the buffet tables. But the core group remained. The senior partners, the investors, the people whose opinions mattered most in a room like this. Daniel seemed completely at ease among them. He stood with one hand casually in his pocket, the other holding a glass of champagne as he spoke. You just have to stay focused, I heard him say. Success doesn't happen because someone gives it to you. A few men nodded approvingly. You build it yourself, Daniel continued. That's the only way it means anything. Someone laughed. Spoken like a true partner. Another toast followed. Glasses clinked again. From across the room, Emily noticed me standing near the bar. For a moment she hesitated, then excused herself from Daniel's group and walked over. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor. Mom, she said when she reached me. Her voice was lower now, more careful. Are you okay? I sipped my sparkling water before answering. Yes. You don't seem upset? I looked at her for a moment. My daughter was 38 now, but sometimes I could still see the young girl she used to be. The one who used to leave little notes around the house. Love you, Mom. Emily glanced back toward Daniel's group. He didn't mean anything by that joke earlier, she said quietly. You know how these events are? Everyone's trying to be funny. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said. I'm beginning to understand that. Emily seemed relieved. I'm glad, she replied. Because Daniel worries about how things look in front of the partners. That sentence caught my attention immediately. How things look, not how things feel. Not whether someone was hurt. Just how things appear. I studied my daughter's face carefully. Emily, I said gently. Did Daniel ever tell his partners about the down payment on your house? She blinked. What? The $25,000. I continued calmly. The one your father and I helped with. Emily's eyes widened slightly. Mom, this isn't the time to talk about that. Why not? She lowered her voice. Because it doesn't matter anymore. Across the room, Daniel's laughter rose above the music again. Emily glanced nervously toward him. Please, she said quietly. Let's not make tonight awkward. I held my glass of water and looked at the crowd celebrating my son-in-law. Then I said something very simple. Emily, I'm not the one who made tonight awkward. She didn't answer. But for the first time since I arrived at that ballroom, my daughter looked genuinely uncomfortable. Emily didn't say anything after that. She simply looked down at the floor for a moment, as if hoping the conversation might quietly disappear if neither of us moved. But awkward silences don't disappear in crowded rooms. They just sit. They're between people. Finally, she exhaled slowly. Mom, she said, please don't do this tonight. Her voice was almost a whisper now. I noticed she kept glancing toward Daniel's group across the ballroom. He was still laughing with the partners, completely unaware of the conversation happening 10 yards away. What exactly do you think I'm doing? I asked gently. Emily hesitated. You're bringing up things that don't matter anymore. I took another small sip of my water before answering. You think helping you buy your first home doesn't matter? That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? She rubbed her forehead lightly. Daniel worked really hard to get where he is, she said. I know he did. And tonight is important for him. I nodded. Yes, I can see that. Emily looked relieved again, as if she believed the conversation was ending. But something inside me had already shifted too far for that. You know, I said quietly, when your father and I gave you that money for the house, Daniel promised something. Emily looked up at me. He promised he would always remember where he came from. The band had started another song behind us, but the music felt distant now. Mom, Emily said carefully, you know Daniel didn't mean to embarrass you earlier. That's interesting, I replied calmly, because it didn't sound accidental. Before Emily could respond, a voice called out from across the room. Emily. Daniel was walking toward us now. Two partners followed a few steps behind him, still holding their drinks. Daniel stopped beside us and smiled. There you are, he said to Emily. We're about to do another round of photos. Then he glanced at me. Well, Margaret, he added lightly, are you still enjoying the party? The partners behind him watched with polite curiosity. Emily shifted slightly beside me. And for the first time that evening, the conversation wasn't happening quietly in a corner. Now there was an audience. I met Daniel's eyes. The same confident expression was still there. The same certainty that he controlled the room. For a moment I considered giving the answer everyone expected. The polite one. The quiet one. But instead, I said something different. Yes, Daniel. I'm enjoying it very much. He smiled. Good. I paused. Then I added calmly. Especially the part where you explain how you built everything on your own. The smile on his face didn't disappear, but something inside it shifted. And suddenly the two partners standing behind him looked a little more interested in this conversation than they had a moment ago. For a moment, Daniel didn't respond. Not because he hadn't heard me, but because he understood exactly what I meant. The two partners standing behind him shifted slightly, their attention sharpening in the quiet space that had suddenly formed around us. Daniel let out a small laugh. Well, he said smoothly, that's how success works, Margaret. You work hard. You stay focused. His voice carried the same confidence he had used all night. But this time, I noticed something different. The room had grown quieter around us. Not silent, just quieter. People nearby had begun listening without pretending they weren't. I nodded slowly. You're right, I said. Hard work matters. Daniel lifted his glass again, as if the conversation had already ended. But I wasn't finished yet. Although, I continued gently, sometimes people forget the small things that help them get started. Daniel's smile tightened slightly. Emily stood beside him, completely still now. I spoke calmly, the same way I had all evening. Like the first apartment you and Emily struggled to afford. Daniel didn't move. Or the hospital bill when Emily got sick during your second year at the firm. One of the partners glanced at him. And of course, I added, the down payment on the house in Evanston. $25,000. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I simply said it. Out loud. In the same calm tone someone might use when mentioning the weather. For a second, Daniel didn't speak. Then one of the partners chuckled softly. Well, the man said, sounds like you had some good family support along the way. Daniel forced a small smile. Yes, well, families help each other. That's true, I replied. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small smile of my own. Not angry, not triumphant, just peaceful, because the truth had finally entered the room. And once truth arrives somewhere, it tends to stay. I turned slightly toward Emily. She looked at me the way people do when they suddenly realize a moment has changed something permanently. Mom, she whispered. But I shook my head gently. It's all right, I said. Then I looked back at Daniel. I truly am proud of how far you've come. And I meant it. Success is still success, even when the path to it isn't quite as simple as someone would like to believe. I set my empty glass on the nearby table. Around us, the party slowly began to breathe again. Music continued. Conversations resumed. But something about the atmosphere had shifted. Daniel's story, the one about building everything completely on his own, no longer sounded quite as perfect as it had earlier. And that was enough. I didn't need applause. I didn't need an apology. Sometimes dignity isn't about winning an argument. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to disappear from the story of your own life. I adjusted the pearl necklace Robert had given me years ago and turned toward the exit of the Grand Regency Ballroom. As I walked past the tables and the glittering chandeliers, I felt something I hadn't expected when the evening began. Not anger, not sadness, relief. Because tonight, in a room full of strangers celebrating success, I had quietly reminded everyone of something very simple. No one builds a life entirely alone. And sometimes, all it takes to change the story is one person willing to say the truth out loud.